Hey, hope you're doing all right. This tutorial is going to be all about the useMutation hook from Apollo client. I am also going to assume that you're familiar with the useQuery hook. If you're not, I do have another video you can check out, but I'm going to be using a useQuery hook in this video, and if you're not familiar with it yet, it's probably fine, but you should definitely be familiar with useQuery hook. So I've got a new directory here. I'm going to create a new I'm going to use create React app to create a new app, and I'm going to use dot to make it in this directory. And while that is building out in the background, you can see this code sandbox. This is the backend that we're going to be utilizing. So Apollo client has some solid documentation, and they provide this kind of sandbox environment for you to run queries and mutations against. And so we do have our type definitions up here. And then the important part, so here's our query where it can pull back a list of all of our to-dos or a single to-do by ID. But then the mutation piece is what we're going to be working with mostly in this video. So we can add a to-do where we'll pass in a type. So this type could be called anything. It could be called task or thing or to do or whatever. I think they just called it type because they didn't want to say to do a bunch of times. And then update to do. We can also update a to do by its ID, and then say, walk the dog. You can change it to walk the cat or whatever. So this is the server that we'll be using. Now that create React app has finished, I'm going to do code. Actually, before opening it up in VS Code, we're going to install a couple of dependencies. So we'll do npm install GraphQL and then @Apollo/client. So those are the only two dependencies or two extra dependencies that we'll need for this. Now we'll open up in VS Code. Actually, I'm not going to use this terminal anymore. I'll just use the integrated one. And we can do yarn start. And while that's getting started up in our app.js, we're going to go ahead and get kind of the boilerplate and the starter file set up. So you can skip ahead if you want to just grab this from the mutations documentation, but I'm going to go through it and kind of give a little bit of an explanation. I think it's better to, at the very least, type it out, but listening to the explanation kind of helps rather than just copying and pasting it. But feel free to skip ahead if you are so inclined. So we're going to import a couple of things at the top. Apollo client in memory cache. Apollo provider, useQuery, and GQL, and all of those are going to be pulled from Apollo client. We're going to create a new instance of Apollo client, and we're going to set it to a variable called client, which will then pass into our provider. So we'll do new Apollo client. It's going to take in an object. The URI is that backend, is pointing to that backend that I just showed you at the beginning of this video. So it's https sxewr.sse.codesandbox.io. And then our cache is going to be a new in-memory cache. Then inside of our app, we can rip out all this stuff in the middle. We can just leave that div. We can cut the div, and then have our Apollo provider with the client set equal to that client that we instantiated up above and set to the variable. And then we'll paste our div back in. Next, we're going to create our fetch all to-dos query. So the to-dos, and we're going to grab the ID and then the type, which is like the to-do task that you're doing. And then we're just going to put all of these functional components in the same file. Not best practice, but it's fine for the purposes of this tutorial. So we'll make our to-dos functional component, and this is where we'll use our get to-dos query. So we'll do loading, error, and data, and we're pulling those off of our useQuery hook, which is going to be utilizing that get to dos query from above. If we're loading, then we'll say loading. If there's an error, then we'll just say there's been an error. And then otherwise, we'll just map through all of our to-dos. So we will return data.todos.map. And we're going to grab the ID and the type. So we'll destructure those out. We're going to initialize a new variable called input, but it's going to be changed. So that's why we're using lat. And then we'll return for each of our to-dos a div with the key of that unique ID. We'll have a paragraph tag, which is going to be the type, or in this case, the to-do. This is the to-do, the task that you're accomplishing. And then we'll just have a little form with an onSubmit handler. And it'll take in an event. We'll e.prevent default on submit, and then input.value.trim. So if we trim the input, like if somebody just hits space a bunch of times and there's no value in the input field, or basically this is just checking to say if the input value is blank, then return. We don't want to submit an empty form. Otherwise, we'll set our input value equal to an empty string. So this is just our kind of starter right now. This isn't doing anything meaningful, but basically what's happening is this input, which we are going to set to a reference that we put on the input element here in a second. We're just clearing that out once we've submitted our to-do so that our input element is blank after it's been submitted. But this isn't doing anything crazy just yet. So inside of our form, we'll have an input, and we'll slap a ref on that bad boy. And so we'll take in the node, and we're going to set our input equal to that node. And this will be self-closing. So this input variable here, we're setting equal to this underlying DOM node. And so that's how we're getting input.value. We're getting the value of this node here, and that's what we're kind of tracking in this submit handler. You could utilize useState and make this a controlled component. We're just going to follow along with the useMutation docs for now, but feel free to make tweaks as you see fit. And then the last piece here is just a button with a type of submit. And this will allow us to update any of these particular to-dos. So this is going to render a list of to-dos. It's going to pull all of the to-dos off of the data object. And then each one will have the to-do item name, the thing that you're doing, and then a little form with an input field and a submit button if you want to update it. So the UI is not going to look nice, but it's going to give you the functionality that you need. Next, we're going to have our add to do component. And this one will be pretty similar, where we'll have an input variable, and then the rest of it is actually pretty similar to this. So we can just copy this return inside of the map and then make a couple of tweaks. So we don't need a key because this is not a mapped array here. We don't need the paragraph tag because this is just a form to add the to-do. And then our onSubmit should be the same. Our input still has the ref, which is the same, type submit. So this will just be add to do. And then the only thing we have left to do down here is we can make like an H1 that says use mutations. And then we'll just pull down our functional components. So add to do and to-dos. And then I'll save that, and VS Code will clean it up for me. GQL is not defined. Looks like I didn't pull it in up above. I put QGL. Okay, now it looks fine. So right now we have kind of our starter code set up, and now we're ready to actually dive into mutating it. So actually updating our data. So let's see what this is looking like right now. We have our use mutations, cool. And nothing is really going to happen because we don't have anything ready to wired up to make a change to the back end. So let's go ahead and do that. So at the top, underneath our get to-dos, we'll have another GraphQL string called add to do. And the mutation is going to look similar to a query. However, you need to add mutation to the beginning of it. And we'll say mutation add to do is going to take in a variable just like you can do with queries. And that variable is going to be called type, and it's going to be a string. And then we'll name our mutation. We'll say add to do is the name of our mutation here in camel case. And we're going to pass in the type because that's the argument that the backend is expecting. And that type is going to be equal to whatever variable type that we pass in. And then we're going to return the ID and the type. So again, type here with the $sign means it's a variable, so we're expecting a string to be passed in. And whatever that string is, that's the argument that we're passing into that add to do mutation. And type in this case means, again, task or thing or to do or whatever the thing that we're doing. Walk the dog, get the groceries, whatever. So now that we've written that mutation, let's go ahead and use it with the useMutation hook. So inside of our add to do functional component underneath input, we're going to write something that looks similar to using the useState hook, where we have a tuple. The first item in that is the add to do, the actual mutation, the function. And then the second is an object with our data. We'll set that equal to useMutation and add to do is the mutation that it's taking in. It looked like VS Code automatically imported useMutation for me. It did there, so make sure useMutation is imported from that Apollo client import. Next thing we need to do is actually just call this add to do, and what we can do is just slap it in the onSubmit underneath the like checking for the blank input. So we'll do add to do and we'll call it. And we can pass in some options. So we'll pass in a variables object. And we're going to pass in just one variable called type. And it's going to be the value of the input. So remember, our input has a ref attached to it. And we're setting that underlying DOM node equal to this input variable that we declared up here. From there, we're grabbing the value off of that input and we're setting it equal to this type variable, which we will then pass in to our add to do mutation. That type is the string, so we're passing it in, and the type is whatever we type into that input. So what'll happen is we'll make this add to do mutation call. It will add this to do to our back end, and we'll have that new data, which is great. The problem is we won't see that automatically update. So if I hit save and I switch back over, we're loading. Let's refresh this just in case. Okay. And actually, so let's add this. So we can just type in some gibberish and hit add to do, but we don't see anything. And if we check our console, we don't see anything there either. But if we go back and inside of our to-dos, underneath error, we can just do console log data. Loading, let's refresh. Okay, so two things happened. One, we refreshed and we actually got our to-do, this random string that we typed in, with its own little update form. And then we also have this data object, which has an array of to-dos, the first of which is this type, this thing that we typed in, and then the ID. So that's great, but how do we get it to automatically update without manually refreshing? Well, the first option is a little bit simpler, where we pass in another option to our mutation. So our add to do mutation, we have variables. After variables, we can do refetch queries. Refetch queries is going to take an array of query objects where we say, okay, the query that we want to refetch is, what do we call it? Get to dos. And so what'll happen is we'll add the to do, and then we'll make this get to dos query one more time after the mutation has been completed. So we'll save this. So we're loading, we have our to do. Now let's add another one. We'll say walk the dog. And then add the to do. And now it showed up. And we can see our data object now has our two to-dos. So this is fine and well for a simple little to-do app. The problem is we're making an extra network call. So we're making the mutation and then we're fetching all of our data. And when we have two to-do items, that's fine. But when we have thousands of pieces of data and we need to refetch that every time, that can be a little bit cumbersome. And you might be fetching more stuff than you need. So what we can utilize is some functionality off of Apollo's cache. So when you're adding a new item, we don't automatically update the cache. What we can do with Apollo, we can update a particular item, which we haven't wired up yet. And that, by grabbing its ID, if we change this to walk the cat, we can update our cache and Apollo would handle that automatically. But when you're deleting items or when you're adding new items or when you're updating multiple items, then you either need to utilize this refetch query or you need to update the cache after a mutation. So let's go ahead and take a look at what that looks like. So first, we'll show you what it looks like with kind of just automatically handling that. So let's get rid of this refetch queries. And we're going to go through the process of updating a query. So we don't have refetch queries anymore. Beneath add to do, we'll do update to do. And this will be a mutation update to do. It needs an ID, which is going to be a string. And then it also needs a type or a to-do that we're doing, which is also going to be a string. An update to-do is the name of the mutation, where the ID is equal to that ID variable that we pass in, and then type is going to be equal to the type variable that we pass in. And it will return our ID and our type, or our to-do item. Then inside of to-dos, we have our loading, our error, our data. We'll also have update to-do. And we'll set that equal to useMutation update to-do. Not making a whole lot of changes here. Let's give them some space underneath the console log. And in our onSubmit, so underneath this blank input check, we'll call update to do. We'll pass in our variables. The first variable is going to be the ID, which is equal to this ID being passed in. And since it's the same name, we can just type it out like that. And then our type is going to be the input.value. So notice, again, we don't have any refetch queries here or anything, not in the add to do either. So if we save this, Apollo should just automatically be able to help us out and update our cache. Getting a CORS error, ran into this before, that was fine. Okay, so we have our add to do. So we have our to do. Now I do need to manually refresh it, and there it is. But if I change this to say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and update the to do, now that automatically updates the cache for me. So it was able to grab that ID. And notice you're like, well, why did he have to refresh the page? That was just because the data became stale, and this is just a sandbox. I assume they have timeouts kind of built in place since people are just using this for practice. But when you make a new to-do, again, you notice that this isn't automatically updated because I'm adding something new. When I refresh the page, you can see that new to-do has been added. But if I want to just update it, now I've updated that to do, and it has automatically updated the cache for me because I'm just updating one thing. I'm not adding anything. Cool. So updating stuff is nice and easy, and there's nothing special that I need to do thanks to Apollo's cache. But I don't want to add something and then have to refresh the page, and I don't want to add something and have to refetch that query because that's an extra network call and I'm worried about fetching too much data. So how do we update the cache? Inside of our add to-dos, or our add to-do component here, we're going to kind of tweak this useMutation a little bit. So we're going to take off this data object, and we're just going to have add to-do. And then inside of this useMutation call, we're going to pass in some options. So we have an object. We're going to call this update function. So we're going to update our cache. So first, we're going to grab the cache object, which will give us access to some different methods that we'll be utilizing. And then we'll grab our data. So we're grabbing our, we're grabbing the cache, and then we're also grabbing an object with a data property, which is then going to give us the result of this add to do mutation. So that's what's going on there. Now, inside of this update function that we're calling, we can grab cache.modify, and we're going to tell it which fields we want to modify. So how do I know which fields I want to modify? Because this data object gives me this to-dos array, so I'm going to tell it to update this to-dos array in the cache. So inside of our fields, We have an object where to-dos is being updated, and it's going to take in our existing to-dos, which we will by default set to an empty array. We'll create a new ref called new to-do ref. And then we'll write a fragment so that we can pass in our new to-do to the current to-dos array, and then attach that to our cache array of to-dos, and then update the UI. So we have our data, the return value of add to do, and then we have our fragment, which is going to be a GraphQL string. Where we say fragment new to do on to do. We've got the ID and the type. So these are going to be our return values. And then we're going to return a new array where we spread in our existing to-dos, and then we just add in our new to-do here. So we're just going to combine the new to-do ref. We're going to concatenate that with the rest of our existing to-dos. So let's go ahead and save that and take a look at what we've got. So normally you shouldn't have to refresh this, but I think we're just kind of getting that with this playground environment. So we have our new, or our add to do. Let's do get groceries. And now we've added it to the bottom. So get groceries, walk the dog, and we're not having to make an extra network call. If we wanted to change this to walk the cat, we could update it, and that the cache is now being updated without having to refetch the query. So pretty cool. Similar to queries, we can also track loading and error states. So if you wanted to have some sort of like, disabled button or like a little loading spinner inside, what we could do is inside of our to-dos functional component, we could rename each of these pieces, since we're going to be reusing loading, error, and data. So we can do loading is, let's say, query loading, and error is query error. And then for our update to do, we can have our second piece in the tuple here is all of the loading and error and data and information and stuff. So for this, we can do loading, mutation, loading, and then error, mutation, error. And then we'll do if the query is loading, return loading. If there's an error with the query, then we can show the error fetching data message. And then what we can do, like down below, is we can say, instead of update to do, we can say mutation loading. If it's loading, we can say like submitting. Otherwise, we'll have it say update to do. And then we can kind of track that. So we'll say walk the cat. We'll change it back to walk the dog. And then update to do. You can see is submitting, and then it tracks back. But other than that, that's all I've got for you. So if you have any questions, as always, let me know in the comments. Other than that, hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.